This evening, Scenic Regional Library and the State Historical Society of Missouri is pleased to present Galen Gritts, Cherokee. Mr. Gritts is a registered member of the Cherokee Nation, a founding member of the Alliance for Native Programming and Initiatives, an advisory board member for the Native American Heritage Fund of the Missouri Humanities Council, and a member of the Disparities Elimination Advisory Committee for the Program of the Elimination of Cancer Disparities of Seitan Cancer Center, Washington University School of Medicine, and Barnes-Jewish Hospital, as well as a representative of the local Native American community. Mr. Gritts will be presenting tonight a program called Forgotten Trunk in the Attic, an overview of why Native folks are invisible to many Missourians, as Missouri and many neighboring states have no exact tribes and haven't for some time. However, Gloria Gaynor was right, they survived. More information about Scenic Regional Library, Mr. Gritts, and the State Historical Society of Missouri will be available at the end of this presentation. Thank you for joining us.
Osio, Dakwadoa Galen Gritts, Chalaji, Sadelawat E, Degega E, St. Louis. Hello, my name is Galen Gritts. I am a Cherokee from St. Louis. I was born and reared here. My Cherokee pedigree is that I am a member of the Wolf Clan. The Cherokees have 7 clans. The other 6 clans are the Longhair, the Blue, the Wild Potato, Deer, Bird, and Pain. There was an 8th clan at one time, and that was the Bear Clan. But the Bear Clan did not like being human, so it went back to being an animal. And I'm kind of happy that I'm a member of the Wolf Clan because, really, not to diss anybody, but I really wouldn't want to be a wild potato. I'm just saying. I would like to recognize in particular the Osage or the Osage and the Missouria, the tribes on whose land we are now occupying. The state is named after the Missouria, and the last Missouria tribal member died in 1985. The Osage now live in northern Oklahoma in a county, Osage County. So they have left Missouri a long time ago. But I am mindful that the Osage continue a sacred relationship with the lands that we now occupy and recognize and appreciate their integral relation to that land. And the cultural heritage of both them, how it contributed to the state and to the history. The Osage that I know, and I have met their chief, Jeffrey Standing Bear, and friends with his spiritual advisor, Johnny Williams, and a number of other ones. They kind of bristle a bit when you suggest that there were other Indians in Missouri, but obviously there had been before the Osage, and they passed through at various times. I am often asked, what is the proper form of address for Native people? Is it American Indian or Native American? I, like many others, use both terms. I prefer Native Americans. Generally, though, you will not ruffle anybody's feathers by using either one or both of them interchangeably. However, if you are referring to a particular person, it's best to refer to that person's tribal membership in the beginning. So in written form, when you first mention a person, you would put parentheses behind their name with their tribe. In my case, it would be Galen Gritts, parentheses, Cherokee. I know Tim Young Eagle, he would be Pawnee. Another person in St. Louis, Danny Danielle, she goes by Danny Tall Chief, is Seneca. So you would put their tribal name behind them. And when introducing them in conversation for the first time, you would do that as well. Kelly Thomas is the director of the Booter Center here in St. Louis at WashU, and she is Seneca. So the Osage were the predominant tribe in what is now Missouri by the time that the Spanish, French, and Americans showed up, pretty much in that order. Then those 3 countries began making treaties among themselves, which of them owned the land, without ever involving the people who had always lived here, meaning the Native Americans, the Native people. And you think of the Louisiana Purchase and really the arrogance from which it was spawned, saying, Lewis and Clark were sent to find out what the land was like. They had no idea. People far away in Washington, people in Paris, people in Madrid, Spain, were making these decisions about these people that lived here and what the land entailed without having a clue. But in addition to those tribes that I mentioned, in historical times, there had been the Oto, the Sauk and Fox, which are kind of the same tribe, more or less, the Iowa, Kansas, Illini, Kickapoo, Peoria, the Shawnee, the Delaware, Sioux, the Piankashaw, and the Cherokee had been involved at one point of being in Missouri. The Cherokees, not for not very long. They were basically passing through. Some were in parts of the states when the Osage were here, and other tribes passed through from their locations further east, trying to escape both the poverty and death, which often accompanied the Americans' ever-growing encroachment. Since the tribes in Missouri had no written language, none of the Native American tribes did, in North America at least, or I should say in the United States. Obviously, the Aztecs and Mayans did down in Mexico and Central America. But the historical times then date from contact with both the Europeans and the Americans. And obviously, they did have written languages. So from the very beginning of the written records that we have, it is the colonial paradigm which defines the native people. So the colonists and the explorers' prejudices and misconceptions influence how we think of Native Americans to this day. In fact, I saw a comedian on YouTube one time talk about that, Columbus being in the Caribbean and coming across a native person and saying, "Hey, you're an Indian, right?" He goes, "No, I'm not." And he named his tribe and he says, "Well, come on, this is the Indies, right?" He goes, "No, it's not." He goes, "That's way over there." And Columbus says, "Come on, you're Indians." But the fact of the matter is we never corrected that over 500 years. And so that's just one example of the misconceptions. But American Indians have been largely left out of the American story and marginalized, except in a distorted and often romanticized way. Worst, after stealing their land and destroying their culture, they became an afterthought. When they are thought of all, it's generally in a caricature. Living in a teepee. Obviously, if you're in Maine or Louisiana or in Missouri, you don't live in teepees. Wearing headdresses, same thing, and grunting how when you greet people. Obviously, they had very, very established languages. Or perhaps in more modern times, the caricature is that they were innately spiritual, somehow more spiritual, or some kind of super ecological kind of a being. It is one of the examples of history's identity theft, basically. Our identity was taken away and replaced with whatever people want to put on us. Now, the occupancy of the state of Missouri by Native people, as I mentioned, was relatively fluid. The Osage claimed Missouri in historical times, but they actually came down the Ohio River Valley at some point prior to first contact. The state was founded in 1821. So the boundaries of the state were an alien construct to the native people's way of living. They did not own land per se. They shared land in a relationship. Archaeology tells us that the native societies in Missouri go back as many as 12,000 to 14,000 years ago. Today, there are 573. That number kind of fluctuates. It's kind of funny, but that's the latest federally recognized tribes to this day or presently. And there are a handful of tribes that are recognized by states that are not recognized by the federal government. The tribes themselves have changed over time and continue to do so. As I mentioned before, the Sauk and Fox were at one time a separate group, but their languages were a lot alike. And as they lost people, they kind of became one tribe. Um, People have heard of the Seminoles down in Florida. They aren't traditionally a tribe at all. With Florida being swamped before John Carrier invented his air conditioning in the 20th century, not very many people lived in Florida. It was hot and there were diseases. And so what happened was slaves would run down there to get away from the plantations in Georgia and South Carolina. And then some of the Irishmen would go down there from New Orleans, and some of the pirates would hide there that were in the Caribbean. And then some of the Indian tribes, the Creeks and the Chickasaws, some of them would go down there and hide. So what they did was form this group, which later became known as the Seminoles. It's kind of a mixed group, but has more Indian blood in it than not because of the various tribes going down there. But historically, it's not a tribe. It became a tribe. Interesting enough, they were never defeated by the United States Army. They finally just gave up and left them there. And then eventually they decided to become more peaceful. I am a member of the Disparities Elimination. This is academia for you, so bear with me. The Disparities Elimination Action Advisory Committee, or DEAC, for the Program for the Elimination of Cancer Disparities, or PCAD. That's at the Siteman Cancer Center here in St. Louis, the Washington University School of Medicine, and Barnes Jewish Hospital. I'm a representative of the local Native American community. Now, what this group does is try to impact the differences in the diagnosis of cancer, the treatment of cancer, and the outcome for minority communities, Hispanic, Black, and Native, in St. Louis, as compared to the dominant cultures. Obviously, the dominant culture has better rates of these. As you go into the minority communities, they start to really rise, and that's a concern. And we have, as part of this group, identified in Missouri and in some cases in Illinois, what we call local medical or food deserts. Now, these are geographical areas which have a lack of either medical resources or a lack of good food sources. Some of these are in the inner city, and most are in rural areas. So if you live in a certain area, a certain zip code, you might have less of access to medical care or certainly good food sources. You think about small towns, the only place that they can sometimes get their food is prepackaged food at Walmart with a lot of preservatives, a lot of salt, and so forth. Other people in the suburbs of St. Louis and Kansas City and Springfield can go to places like Fresh Times and Trader Joe's and those kind of places and pay more money, but get fresher food, stuff that's less processed, I guess would be a word. So here in Missouri, we happen to live in a Native American desert, along with Arkansas, Illinois, Iowa, Kentucky, and Tennessee, which is kind of the center of this country. We contain no federally recognized tribes. Kansas has 4 tribes within its borders, or reservations as they're sometimes called. They're small, but they do have them. And there are tribes in Michigan, Wisconsin, New York State, and other states. Now, obviously, you start talking about Oklahoma, Arizona, North, New Mexico, the Dakotas, you're going to run into a lot more Indians out there. So, but here, right in the middle of the country, there aren't that many. So in July of 2019, about 2 years ago, the census at that time estimated Missouri's population of about 6 million people, a little over that. Native Americans made up only 0.6%, not even 1%, a little over half of 1% of the state's population. Generally in the US, across all states, Native Americans make up about 3% of the population. So we're 5 times lower than that. We have not that many Native people, and they're not very recognizable. If you go to Michigan, I've been there twice in the last couple of years, people will tell you in southern Michigan, oh, I have a cousin or a brother that lives up north and he's married to a Native. or he went to college up there and he knows this tribe, or this, that, or the other. We don't have that kind of shoulder rubbing because there aren't that many here. And as I mentioned, they tend to be more invisible because we don't have centers. Kansas City has an Indian center. St. Louis does not. We used to, but we lost it. And I believe the census said there were 80,000 people in Missouri that are native. About 18,000 of those live in St. Louis. I'm not sure about Kansas City because I'm not from there, but I'm sure it would be similar. Now, you, of course, not that long ago, from a historical time viewpoint, we made up 100% of the entire Western Hemisphere, not just the state of Missouri. So that is a near perfect ethnic cleansing or genocide in essence. And you can understand why when Native people get together, sometimes we like to say, hey, let's party like it's 1491. In the center of this country, as I mentioned, there are no extant tribal organizations. And this is really by design. Our area was engineered that way. For the most part, these states that are in the middle that I mentioned, Arkansas, Illinois, Iowa, Kentucky, Missouri, and Tennessee, had good farming land for the state of the agricultural technology that the Europeans and then the early Americans had. And so they wanted the land. It was quickly taken from the Indians who were pushed into the plains. Now, these are wasteland for the farmers of the time and the homesteaders. And so they took over these lands and pushed the Indians out to Nebraska and South Dakota, Kansas, Oklahoma. Gottfried Dutton was a German immigration writer in the early 19th century. He had a very famous book, and this is going to be another long term, Report of a Journey to the Western States of North America and a Multi-Year Sojourn in the years 1824 through 1827. Not exactly an easy thing to refer to. This gave a romantic and glowing description of the Missouri River Valley between St. Louis and Hermann, Missouri, and it became a huge bestseller in Germany, in spite of its unwieldy title. He established a farm near what is now Dutzel, I've heard it pronounced Dutzo as well, Missouri, and his book on the region, comparing the Missouri River to the Rhine River in Germany, and his positive remarks about the climate and soils in Missouri, led to untold tens of thousands of German immigrants coming to the area beginning in the late, or not late, but beginning in the 1830s. By the time of the Civil War, which is 1861, the majority of people living in St. Louis had been German born. Not German speaking, not descendants, but first generation German born. In 1900, there were 6 daily newspapers in St. Louis that were published in German. And so that had that big impact. And obviously there were other groups of white settlers that came in to the United States and came in through Missouri. They kind of came in waves. Originally you had some English, Henry Shaw, that's found in Shaw's Garden, the Botanical Garden, which is from Sheffield, England. And then the Germans after 1848, because of a revolution that happened there. And as I mentioned, in the 30s, some came over as well. And then later you had the Irish, the Italians, and so forth, settling in different neighborhoods and then being integrated into the bigger culture. But this flood of immigration from Europe's, they were, for the most part, they were fleeing. I mean, you don't put your family in danger. You don't give up everything. They were fleeing really horrid conditions of their own cultures. And these were kings, strong man leadership, concentration of wealth with the nobles, and lack of diversity acceptance, persecutions for political or religious beliefs. So strong man leadership, concentration of wealth, and lack of diversity acceptance sounds eerily like a portion of the United States today. And of course, the irony being is perhaps our forebears tried to get away from those things, and these things are showing up here in the modern America. But in any case, it was easy to cherry pick the land where the farmer was easiest. And unfortunately for the Native Americans, it happened to be their homes. So after they defended their lands through military action, or homeland security, as we might call it today, the U.S. developed policies to remove them by treaty. So Hall of Famer Willie Keeler said, "The key to hitting in baseball is to hit them where they ain't." The same can be said for U.S. Indian policy. Send them where we ain't. So removal meant sending the tribes to the plains because they were deemed not valuable and they was useless for exploitation. However, there were Native people that had been living successfully out there for years, the Comanches, the Arapaho, etc. But the Great Plains of Dakotas, both north and south, Nebraska, Kansas, and Oklahoma, and to a degree, northern Missouri, parts of Iowa, were not farmable by the whites at the time because they used wooden plows. And the plows would break in the sod because the prairie grass had roots that would go down as far as 30 feet and were very tangled up. Nothing had ever broken the plains before. And so you couldn't grow anything there. And that's how the Sioux, who were originally from Wisconsin and Minnesota, ended up in a place called the Badlands in South Dakota. The land was thought to be unlivable. Wisconsin and Minnesota became states after Missouri, but again, it was good farmland. You didn't have as long as a season as we do here because it's further north, but eventually they got pushed out onto the plains. One of the groups that was forced to be removed on the Trail of Tears was my tribe, the Cherokees, and they were made to leave their ancestral homes in the southeastern United States, basically at bayonet point, and were forced to move to what was known on the maps at that time as the Great American Desert. We now know it as the state of Oklahoma. But again, the whites thought there was nothing out there. So on their squalid march from the southeast to Oklahoma on the Trail of Tears, a quarter of them died. Now, think if COVID had a 25% death rate. As of 2 weeks ago, the US COVID death rate was 0.017%, not even close to 1% of the general population. The Spanish flu in 1918 killed roughly 5% of the world's population. That's a rate of 294% more than what COVID is doing. So obviously the Spanish flu in 1918 was more terrifying, but neither COVID nor the Spanish flu was nowhere near 25% death rate that the Cherokee suffered on their Trail of Tears. Now, all deaths are to be mourned. I do not state this to lessen the impact of anyone's suffering or loss of life. I make this comparison simply because the personal effect of the Trail of Tears on the tribes, Cherokees were just one of the tribes that were moved from the southeast, is often diluted by the myth of inevitability. I can't say that. Forced relocations by the Native Americans to enrich oneself is a series of deliberate decisions by individuals. So I want to point that out. There's not just an age in history where this is bound to happen. We make decisions and there are consequences to those. Just as an aside, smallpox, which ravaged the Native Americans because they had no immunity, had a death rate of 90%. And that's a topic for another time, but I think it was well worth mentioning. As a lifelong St. Louis and Missourian, I had always thought that the Trail of Tears crossed the state somewhere down around Cape Girardeau and St. Genevieve, which is one of the routes. In fact, tomorrow on Friday, my wife and I will be driving down to the Trail of Tears Park in Cape Girardeau County to go on a couple of hour hike. I found out only 4 years ago that there are actually 3 routes that cross Missouri that the Cherokees used to on the Trail of Tears. And the northernmost route, which I did not know about till then, and which happened to be the one most traveled by the Cherokees, comes within an hour of St. Louis, down around Cuba in Stillville. That was a surprise to me. Of the 9 states that the Cherokees cross on their Trail of Tears, Missouri has the most miles. And the Missouri Humanities Council is making great efforts to recover information about all 3 of these trails. Now, I am a card-carrying member of the Cherokee Nation. This is my membership card to the Cherokee Nation. It's kind of cool. It's got all these things on it, kind of like the dollar bills today. And I am registered to vote in tribal elections, which there is going to be one next month. My father was born and reared in Oklahoma. He did not speak English until he was 8 years old. There is a standard joke among all tribes, not just the Cherokees, that white people have a Cherokee grandmother climbing their family tree. And for some reason, when told that you are a native, whether it be Navajo, Pawnee, Cherokee, obviously, white people will tell of a female relative, ancestor, who they think is Cherokee. It is never a male relative. I told my wife that when we got married and said, you'll hear people tell you, oh, Galen's Cherokee. I have a grandmother or a great-grandmother or somebody. And I said, it'll never be a male. And we've been married 27 years, and she hears that about 7 to 8 times a year and has never been a male. It's always a female. Now, obviously, if this was true, percentages would make it half and half. But they will tell you that because their relative had dark hair, high cheekbones, and an aquiline nose, they must be an American Indian. They do this overlooking the fact that these characteristics could describe a Greek, an Egyptian, an Italian, Turkish, Jewish, or really any other nationalities. But in any case, that's just one of those things that you hear about. When the Cherokees finally arrived after the Trail of Tears, broken and dejected, to Oklahoma, they immediately started to reconstitute their Supreme Court, their legislature, and executive branch, which had all been patterned on the U.S. models when they lived in the Southeast. They resumed publication of their newspaper, the Phoenix. It is still being published today, and I wrote several book reviews for it back in the 1970s. They opened the first school for higher education for women west of the Mississippi. However, within 22 years, from 1839 to 1861, then the Civil War began, and it was devastating to the Cherokees and many tribes in Oklahoma. Many of the Indians fought for the South because they thought it would be a great way to get back at the U.S. government for the Trail of Tears. And in our case, all of our new buildings except for one were burnt, including the female seminary that we started. Well, it wasn't a seminary, but school that we started. And their wealth that they had built in that 2 generations or 20 years was destroyed. So in 1865, they start rebuilding again. And even though the land was given to them at the end of the Trail of Tears in 1839, as long as the grass is green, this will be yours and the waters run. This was soon discarded because whites began to clamor for land in Oklahoma. Now, keep in mind that there was never a single treaty by the United States government with any American Indian tribe that was kept by the United States government. Not a single one. It's a devastating fact. So here's what happened. Since the Cherokees arrived in Oklahoma in 1839, John Deere, Cyrus McCormick, and others had invented steel plows and rotors. Now, these could break up the sod of the prairies. So when the land was deemed no good, it was fine for the Indians. Now that it was worth something as cropland or ranching, it was taken from them, as their earlier homes had been. The United States Congress passed a law, and Native people know very much about this, called the Dawes Act in 1887, which took the land from the tribes and gave it to individual tribal citizens, many of who could not speak English or did not know how to read or write. This way was easier to swindle or take the land from the individual's family allotment because it was far away from their prying eyes of their more educated leaders. The tribal leaders sometimes were lawyers, editors of papers, very, very well educated, and they protected the tribal members that were not. And now all of a sudden that's gone, and you own your land and you're poor, so you might be tempted to sell it. My family's allotment was in Sequoyah County, Oklahoma. That's on the southern side of the tribal lands. There's 16 counties in Oklahoma that make up the Cherokee Nation. It is considered, Sequoyah County, the home of the traditionalists, people who try to keep the old ways. Many of the allotments from the very beginning ended up in white people's possession, and more so as time passed. This further diluted the native culture as a checkerboard presence of whites and Indians reduced their tribal identity, their use of their language, and even their genetics as they tended to intermarry, people being what they are. So in 1889, 2 years after the Dawes Act, the Oklahoma land rush occurred. So the charade of hiding naked greed was over. The emperor indeed had no clothes of subterfuge. People could rush onto Indian lands willy-nilly at a certain time and stake their claims. So much for as long as the grass is green and the waters run. That was only 50 years after they were given the land. Now, interesting enough, the people who cheated and crossed the starting line early were called Sooners. This, I kid you not, is the state motto of Oklahoma. The Sooners, or those who cheated their fellow white neighbors. Don't ask me. So with the discovery of oil, it furthered the disintegration of tribal life. Oil wildcatters discovered new ways to take Indian land. John Paul Getty from Minnesota learned that Oklahoma wildcatting from his father and would at one time be the richest man in the world, having made his initial wealth from Indian land. He did this by utilizing the effect of the Dawes Act. It did allow a huge transfer of wealth from Indians to whites in terms of farming, ranching land, and oil rights. And even though the Osage left Missouri way back in 1808, and there were no really Indian tribes here since that time, the state of Missouri passed a law in 1899 making it illegal for American Indians to be in the state. The maximum fine was $250, the minimum fine, or 30 days in jail. I should say and/or, you could get both. And there was no maximum time or punishment set or fine. Now, this may seem like a long time ago, but all of my grandparents were alive then, and I remember them very distinctly. My mom's dad died before I was born, so he's out of the picture, but her mother, my grandmother, loved to listen to KMOX and watch the Lawrence Welk show, and I do believe she cheated at gin rummy. And my grandparents in Oklahoma, they loved us to drive them to Ten Killer Lake to fish because they owned no car. So when we visited, that's what we would do. And on Saturday nights, they watched boxing on a small black and white TV, which had horrible reception. And in the morning, my grandfather would bring in wood he had chopped for my grandmother so she could start the stove to make breakfast for us. So that was not that long ago that it was illegal for me to be in the state. That law was later repealed. In 1907, Oklahoma became a state, and American Indians did not become U.S. citizens till 1924. This, unfortunately, is as a group, they have served in all of our nation's war at a higher percentage of their population than any other ethnic group, and still do to this day. You'll find more Native Americans at a higher percentage in the services as veterans. Now, my own father was 9 years old when the Indian Citizen Act was passed. So he was born in 1915. So for 9 years, he was not a U.S. citizen. He served on a ship in World War II, whose crew received the most medals in that war for a Navy vessel. And it was also the most damaged ship in the U.S. history to ever make it back to port. He was not discharged in 1947, even though he was injured in March of 45, 50 miles off the coast of Japan. Most World War II servicemen were mustered out very quickly in 1945, but my father had to recover another 2 years beyond that. The Osage, who had fought valiantly in World War II, were not granted any veteran benefits when the war ended. They had to take legal action to gain them, and they eventually were successful some years after peacetime prosperity was rewarding their comrades with low-rate mortgages and inexpensive college educations, as they themselves had to wait on the sidelines for the court. From the 1880s until the 1960s, Indian boarding schools took children away from their families and further eroded language and relationships with their tribes. Just 2 years ago, I met a Shawnee from Oklahoma in Perry County, Missouri, at an archaeological dig. And he was telling me about boarding schools. He lived off a dirt road in Oklahoma when he was a child. And whenever a car was heard, which was a rare event, his mother would tell he and his siblings to go high because she was afraid of that car belonging to people looking to kidnap them to go to boarding school. That's why my father did not learn English till he was 8. His mother, my grandmother, also hid him since they lived outside of town. And they finally learned about him, and she made sure that they would keep him in the local school rather than sending him off to boarding school. I have heard that story many times in both the U.S. and Canada. The boarding schools removed them from their homes, and sometimes there was physical and sexual abuse. And lastly, in 1956, there was a relocation act by the United States that was to encourage American Indians to leave Indian reservations and to their traditional lands and come to the cities and suburbs. It was part of the termination policy of that era, which has been reversed to a degree, but unfortunately some tribes were terminated and did not come back. It also increased the population of Native people living in urban areas. They were isolated from their communities. They faced racial discrimination. They found low-paying jobs in the city with very little advancement potential. They were promised training. It did not materialize. They could not return home sometimes because their reservations had been dissolved. St. Louis was one of the very few destination cities, as was Chicago, San Francisco, and one or two others. So Indians arrived here in the late 50s and 60s at Union Station by train. Wilmer Mankeller, who's the former chief of the Cherokees and a very well-respected leader, was sent to San Francisco with her family when she was a young person, and she eventually made it back to Oklahoma and became our chief. Today, the Cherokee Nation has 380,000 members worldwide. 141 of them are living, 141,000 are living within the 16 counties of northeastern Oklahoma. As you can see, most of us are living at large, as we call it, or live off the reservation. We're not living large, we're living at large. Big difference. For many Cherokees today, it takes a deliberate effort to learn Cherokee history and identity. You don't hear the language spoken. You don't rub elbows with elders or other people. I go home to Oklahoma every so often. I will be down there in July. I was down there last September. I go to our tribal headquarters in Tahlequah, Oklahoma. So it's important to me to reestablish that connection. If any of the things I talked about today were unknown to you, and I'm sure some of them probably were, remember that Native American history is American history. It is not the history of a foreign land like England or Italy or Germany. It is not a mistake that you don't know these things. They were put away in a trunk in our country's consciousness. They were put in the attic to be forgotten so other stories could be told instead. Creation stories are important to any civilization. They all have them. We must honestly recognize the vibrancy and loss to Native Americans in the creation of the U.S. In recent years, I have seen an awakening of truth concerning Native people in this land. To move forward, we must know where we have been. Oftentimes, it may make us feel uncomfortable. I share these things not to make anyone feel guilty or ashamed. My people, the Cherokees, have 7 cardinal directions: beyond north, south, east, and west. We have up, down, and here. Anytime you walk a trail, if you're looking at the path for stones or roots to avoid tripping over, you're not seeing the birds and the trees above you. And where you were 5 minutes ago is not where you are now. The 7 cardinal directions are a much more powerful and useful way to experience the world. It is relational. We need to be able to see each other clearly as human beings for us to relate to each other. The time of exploitation is over. From within our better natures, we must build bridges of understanding. With each new breath, we have a new chance. Wado. Thank you.